The rain had no mercy that night. It fell in thick, angry sheets across the cracked asphalt of the old highway, drumming against the earth like 1,000 impatient fingers. The darkness was absolute, swallowing everything beyond the weak glow of a single flickering streetlight that stood crooked and tired by the roadside. In this forgotten stretch of road between the village of Ojidi and the bustling city of Lagos, where travelers rarely stopped and help was even rarer, a young woman stood drenched to the bone, her thin wrapper clinging to her frail frame like a second skin. Her name was Adana, and she was 23 years old, though the weight she carried in her eyes made her seem much older. She had been walking for hours, her bare feet blistered and bleeding, her small bundle of belongings clutched tightly against her chest. Inside that bundle was everything she owned in this world: a faded photograph of parents she barely remembered, a rosary her late grandmother had pressed into her palm before dying, and 300 naira she had saved from weeks of selling oranges by the roadside. It wasn't much, but it was all she had, and it represented the only hope she possessed of starting a new life in the city, far away from the uncle who had thrown her out of his house that very morning, calling her a burden and a curse. Adana had never known what it meant to be wanted. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was only 5 years old, leaving her in the care of relatives who saw her as nothing more than an extra mouth to feed. She had grown up sleeping on a mat in the corner of her uncle's kitchen, waking before dawn to fetch water, sweep the compound, and prepare breakfast for a family that never once thanked her. She ate their leftovers, wore their cast-off clothes, and endured their cruel words with a silence that had become her armor. Her uncle's wife had been particularly vicious, reminding Adana daily that she was nothing, that she would never be anything, that her parents' deaths were probably a blessing because they would have been ashamed of the worthless child they had left behind. Adana had learned to shrink herself, to make herself invisible, to move through the world like a shadow that no one noticed or cared about. But beneath that practiced invisibility, beneath the layers of hurt and humiliation, there lived a girl who still believed that kindness existed somewhere in the world, that goodness was real, and that perhaps if she could just survive long enough, she might one day find a place where she belonged. The rain intensified, and Adana stumbled forward, her vision blurred by water and exhaustion. She had been walking since early afternoon, and night had fallen with the swiftness of a curtain dropping on a stage. She had nowhere to go, no plan beyond reaching Lagos and finding work, any work that would allow her to rent a small room and feed herself. She had heard stories of girls from the village who had gone to the city and found jobs as housemaids, shop assistants, or restaurant workers. Some had even learned trades and started their own businesses. Adana didn't dare dream that big, but she hoped that perhaps she could be one of the lucky ones who found an employer who wasn't cruel, who paid on time, who treated her like a human being rather than a disposable thing. It was a small hope, barely a flicker in the vast darkness of her circumstances, but it was enough to keep her moving forward, one painful step after another. Then she saw it, a car stopped on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking weakly in the downpour. It was an expensive vehicle, sleek and black, the kind that Adana had only ever seen speeding past on the highway, carrying important people to important places. The hood was raised and steam rose from the engine in ghostly wisps that disappeared into the night. A man stood beside the car, his white shirt soaked through, his expensive shoes ruined by mud. He was pacing back and forth, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice rising in frustration as he shouted into it, though the words were stolen by the wind and rain before they could reach Adana's ears. She should have kept walking. Every survival instinct she possessed told her to keep her head down, to stay invisible, to not get involved in the problems of strangers, especially wealthy strangers whose worlds were so far removed from hers that they might as well exist on different planets. But something made her stop. Perhaps it was the memory of her grandmother's voice, soft and steady, telling her that the measure of a person's worth wasn't found in what they owned but in what they gave when they had nothing left to give. Perhaps it was simply that Adana, who had spent her entire life being ignored and dismissed, couldn't bear to walk past someone in need without offering help, even if that help would likely be refused. She approached slowly, her heart pounding in her chest, her hands trembling not just from cold but from fear. The man didn't notice her at first. He was too busy arguing with whoever was on the other end of his phone call, his frustration evident in every sharp gesture and clipped word. Adana cleared her throat softly, then a little louder when he didn't respond. Finally, he turned, and for a moment they simply stared at each other, this soaked, muddy girl with her threadbare clothes and desperate eyes, and this man who looked like he had stepped out of a magazine advertisement, all sharp angles and expensive cologne that somehow cut through even the smell of rain and earth. His expression shifted from surprise to confusion to something that might have been pity, though Adana couldn't be sure in the darkness. He lowered his phone, and for several long seconds neither of them spoke. The rain continued to fall, indifferent to their silence, washing over them both without distinction or mercy. "Please, sir, I can help you." The words left Adana's lips before she could stop them, soft and hesitant, almost swallowed by the storm that raged around them both. The man's eyebrows lifted in disbelief, and for a moment Adana saw herself through his eyes, a bedraggled village girl soaked and shivering, offering assistance with a car that probably cost more than every house in her village combined. She expected him to laugh, to wave her away with the casual dismissiveness that wealthy people reserved for those they considered beneath them. Instead, he studied her face with an intensity that made her want to look away, his dark eyes searching for something she couldn't name. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the tension that held his shoulders rigid, the barely controlled frustration that simmered just beneath his polished exterior. He was younger than she had initially thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if it weren't so hardened by whatever burdens he carried. There was a weariness about him that went beyond the inconvenience of a broken-down car on a rainy night, something deeper and more profound that Adana recognized, because she had seen it in her own reflection every morning of her life. He finally spoke, his voice lower than she expected, roughened by fatigue and something that might have been surprise. "You know about cars?" There was no mockery in the question, only genuine curiosity tinged with skepticism. Adana nodded, remembering the months she had spent watching the mechanic in her village, a kind old man named Papa Chidi who had allowed her to sit in the corner of his workshop when her uncle's house became too unbearable. Papa Chidi had never minded her presence. In fact, he had seemed to appreciate having someone who listened when he explained the mysteries of engines and carburetors, someone who asked questions and remembered the answers. He had taught her without really meaning to, showing her how to diagnose problems by sound and smell, how to identify which part had failed by the pattern of symptoms, how to coax stubborn machines back to life with patience and understanding. It had been one of the few bright spots in her otherwise dark existence, those quiet afternoons in Papa Chidi's workshop, where she had felt useful and valued, where her presence had been welcome rather than tolerated. She moved toward the car without waiting for permission, drawn by an instinct that had served her well in the past. The man stepped aside, watching her with an expression that hovered between amusement and bewilderment. Adana leaned over the engine, ignoring the rain that pelted against her back, focusing instead on the hissing, clicking sounds that emanated from the mechanical heart of the vehicle. She had learned to listen, really listen, to the language that machines spoke when they were in distress. This one was telling her a story of overheating and pressure, of fluids that had gone where they shouldn't and parts that had expanded beyond their normal tolerances. She traced the problem with her eyes first, following the path of hoses and belts, noting where steam rose most thickly, where metal gleamed with the wrong kind of moisture. Then she reached in with careful hands, touching components with a gentleness that belied her rough circumstances, feeling for heat patterns and loose connections. The man's phone rang again, shrill and insistent, but he ignored it this time, his attention fixed entirely on the girl who had appeared out of nowhere and was now examining his car's engine with the confidence of someone who actually knew what she was doing. Adana could feel his gaze on her, heavy and assessing, but she pushed the awareness aside and concentrated on the task at hand. She had found the problem, a radiator hose that had split along a weak seam, spilling coolant and causing the engine to overheat. It was a simple fix, or at least it would have been if they had been in a workshop with proper tools and replacement parts. But here, on this dark stretch of highway with nothing but rain and darkness for company, the solution would require improvisation. Adana straightened up, water streaming from her hair and face, and turned to the man with a determination that surprised even herself. "The radiator hose is broken," she explained, her voice stronger now, steadied by the familiar territory of mechanical problems that had clear solutions. "The engine got too hot and the pressure made it burst. If you have tape or cloth, something to wrap it with, I can patch it enough to get you to the next town. It won't hold forever, but it will hold long enough." The man stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then something shifted in his face. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. A softening around the edges, a loosening of that rigid control he seemed to maintain over his features. He moved to the trunk of the car and returned with a small emergency kit, the kind that expensive vehicles came equipped with but that most owners never actually used. Inside was electrical tape, a flashlight, and a few basic tools. Adana accepted them with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold now, but from the sudden awareness of what she was doing, of how surreal this entire situation was. She worked quickly, wrapping the split hose with layers of tape, her movements practiced and sure despite the difficult conditions. The man held the flashlight for her without being asked, angling it so she could see what she was doing, and in that small gesture of cooperation, something unspoken passed between them. Adana was acutely aware of his presence, of the expensive watch on his wrist that caught the light as he adjusted the flashlight's position, of the quality of his clothes despite their current ruined state, of the subtle scent of his cologne that somehow persisted through the rain and oil and rubber. She was also aware of how close they stood, two strangers brought together by circumstance and necessity, their worlds colliding in this unlikely moment on a forgotten highway. When she finished, she tested her work carefully, checking for stability and secure wrapping, and then stepped back to let him start the engine. The car rumbled to life, no longer hissing and steaming, its mechanical distress temporarily resolved. The man stared at the dashboard gauges as they settled into normal ranges, then looked at Adana with an expression that contained equal parts gratitude and disbelief. He opened his mouth as if to speak, closed it again, then finally managed to form words. "Thank you, I don't know what to say. You just saved me from spending the entire night on this road." Adana nodded, suddenly uncomfortable with his attention, with the weight of his gratitude. She had only done what anyone with her knowledge would have done. What Papa Chidi had taught her was the right thing to do when someone needed help. She mumbled something about it being nothing, about hoping the repair would hold until he reached proper assistance, and then she turned to Lave to continue her journey into the rain and darkness, back to being invisible and alone. But his hand caught her arm, gentle but firm, stopping her before she could disappear back into the storm from which she had emerged. Adana froze, her heart hammering against her ribs with a force that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with fear. In her experience, when men with power and money touched girls like her, it rarely ended well. She had heard the stories whispered in the village, tales of young women who had accepted help from strangers only to find themselves trapped in situations they couldn't escape, their kindness repaid with cruelty and violation. Her body tensed, preparing to run, to fight if necessary, to protect the little dignity she still possessed even if it cost her everything. But when she looked up into his face, bracing herself for the worst, what she saw there wasn't predatory intent or entitled expectation. Instead, she found concern, confusion, and something that looked almost like distress. He released her arm immediately, as if only just realizing he had grabbed her, and took a step back to give her space. The rain continued to fall between them, creating a curtain of water that blurred the edges of everything, making the moment feel suspended somehow, existing outside of normal time and consequence. "Wait," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of rain with an urgency that seemed out of proportion to the situation. "You can't just walk away. It's the middle of the night, there's a storm, and you're alone on this highway. Where are you going? Do you have somewhere safe to stay?" The questions tumbled out of him in a rush, and Adana found herself unable to answer any of them. Where was she going? Toward Lagos, toward an uncertain future, toward the vague hope that she might find work and shelter before her small savings ran out or before something terrible happened to her. Did she have somewhere safe to stay? No, she had nothing and no one, and the truth of that reality pressed down on her with crushing weight. She stood there in the rain, this girl who had just saved a stranger's night, and realized that she couldn't even save herself. The absurdity of it threatened to pull a bitter laugh from her throat, but she swallowed it down along with the tears that wanted to come. She had cried enough in her life. She was tired of crying. The man seemed to read something in her silence, in the way she held herself with that particular stiffness that comes from carrying too much pain for too long. His expression shifted again, and Adana watched as something like recognition crossed his features, as if he saw in her a reflection of something he understood. "My name is Chukwumeka," he offered, his voice softer now, stripped of the impatience and frustration that had colored it earlier. "Chukwumeka Okonkwo, my friends call me Emeka. I own a construction company in Lagos, well, several companies actually. I was driving back from a business meeting when the car broke down." He paused, seeming to struggle with what to say next, how to bridge the enormous gap between their circumstances. "I want to help you. Let me give you a ride at least, get you out of this rain. You saved me tonight. The least I can do is make sure you're safe." Adana's instinct was to refuse, to maintain her independence even in the face of impossible odds, but practicality warred with pride in her exhausted mind. She was soaked to the bone, her feet were bleeding, and she had miles still to walk before she reached the outskirts of Lagos. The rain showed no signs of stopping, and with each passing hour her chances of reaching the city safely decreased, while the dangers of traveling alone at night increased. She thought of her grandmother, who had always told her to accept kindness when it was genuinely offered, to recognize the difference between charity that uplifted and charity that humiliated. There was no condescension in Emeka's offer, no suggestion that he expected anything in return beyond the satisfaction of knowing she was safe. Still, she hesitated, weighing risks and possibilities, trying to see the trap that her experience told her must be hidden somewhere in this moment. "I don't want to trouble you," she finally managed, her voice barely audible over the rain. It was a weak protest, and they both knew it. Emeka shook his head, already moving toward the passenger side of the car to open the door for her. "You fixed my car in the middle of a storm when you had every reason to keep walking and mind your own business. The only trouble here would be me leaving you on this road and spending the rest of my life wondering what happened to you." There was a raw honesty in his words that cut through Adana's defenses more effectively than any amount of persuasion could have. She found herself moving toward the car, her body making the decision before her mind had fully processed it. The interior was warm and dry, a stark contrast to the cold wetness that had been her reality for hours. The leather seats were soft beneath her, and she tried not to think about how she was ruining them with her muddy, soaked clothes. Emeka climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine, checking the gauges one more time before pulling back onto the highway. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken questions and observations. Adana kept her eyes fixed on the road ahead, watching the headlights carve tunnels of light through the darkness and rain. She was acutely aware of the space she occupied, of how out of place she was in this expensive car with this obviously wealthy man. She clutched her small bundle of belongings tighter against her chest, as if it could protect her from the vulnerability she felt. Emeka seemed content to let the silence stretch, though she could feel him glancing at her periodically, his concern evident even in profile. Finally, he spoke again, his voice careful and measured. "What's your name, and where exactly in Lagos are you trying to get to?" The questions were simple enough, but Adana found herself reluctant to answer them. Giving him her name felt like handing over a piece of herself, like opening a door she had learned to keep firmly locked. But he had been kind to her, and kindness deserved honesty in return. "Adana," she said quietly, testing how her name sounded in this new context, spoken to someone who had no history with her, no preconceived notions about who she was or what she was worth. "My name is Adana Ez. I'm going to Lagos to find work. I don't have a specific place yet. I was going to figure that out when I arrived." She heard how pathetic it sounded even as the words left her mouth, how naive and unprepared she must seem to someone like him who probably had every detail of his life planned and organized. But Emeka didn't laugh or lecture. Instead, he was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the steering wheel as he navigated the wet roads with practiced ease. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was choosing his words carefully, aware that what came next would matter. I have hotels, Adana, several of them actually, part of my business portfolio. One of them needs housekeeping staff. The head housekeeper mentioned it just last week. The pay is fair, the work is honest, and you'd have a room provided as part of the employment package. If you want it, the job is yours. The offer hung in the air between them, almost too good to be true, and Adana's first instinct was to question it, to search for the hidden cost or condition that surely must accompany such generosity. But when she turned to look at him, she saw only sincerity in his profile, illuminated by the dashboard lights. He kept his eyes on the road, perhaps to give her privacy to process his words, perhaps because he was uncomfortable with his own impulse toward charity. Adana's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't name. Gratitude, disbelief, hope, fear, all tangled together into something that made breathing difficult. How does a person learn to trust again when trust has only ever brought them pain? The question echoed through Adana's mind as she sat in the passenger seat of Emeka's car, her wet clothes slowly soaking into the expensive leather beneath her. She wanted to believe him, wanted to accept his offer with the same simple faith that children have before the world teaches them to doubt every kindness, to search for hidden motives behind every generous gesture. But she wasn't a child anymore. Life had stripped that innocence away layer by painful layer until all that remained was a young woman who understood that nothing came without cost, that every gift had strings attached, that men like Emeka didn't help girls like her unless they wanted something in return. And yet, even as these thoughts cycled through her weary mind, another part of her whispered that perhaps not everyone was cruel, that perhaps sometimes people did good things simply because they could, because it was right, because they had been given so much that sharing a little didn't diminish them at all. She studied his profile in the dim light from the dashboard, trying to read the truth of his intentions in the set of his jaw, the line of his shoulders, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel with casual competence. "Why are you doing this?" The question emerged before she could stop it, raw and direct, cutting through the polite surface of their interaction to the uncertainty beneath. "You don't know me, I could be anyone, I could be lying about everything. Why would you offer me a job, a place to stay when you know nothing about me except that I fixed your car?" She expected him to be offended by her bluntness, by the implicit suggestion that his motives might not be pure. Instead, he seemed to appreciate the honesty, his expression shifting into something that looked almost relieved, as if her suspicion made her more real to him, more human than the grateful, compliant person she might have pretended to be. He was quiet for a moment, navigating around a particularly deep puddle that had formed in the road, and when he finally answered, his voice carried a heaviness that spoke of its own complicated history. 5 years ago, I was on top of the world, he began, his eyes never leaving the road as he spoke. My businesses were thriving, I had just gotten engaged to a woman I thought I loved, my family was proud of me, and everything I touched seemed to turn to gold. I thought I had figured out life, that success was simply a matter of working hard and making smart decisions. Then my younger sister, Kioma, got sick, cancer, aggressive and fast-moving. We had money for the best doctors, the best hospitals, the best treatments, but none of it mattered. She died 6 months after diagnosis. She was only 19 years old. His voice cracked slightly on the last sentence, and Adana felt her chest tighten with unexpected sympathy. She knew about loss, about the way death could reach into your life and tear away the people who mattered most, leaving holes that never quite filled in, no matter how much time passed. Emeka continued, seeming to need to tell this story now that he had started it, as if Adana's question had opened a door he rarely allowed himself to walk through. After Kioma died, everything fell apart. My fiancée left. She said she couldn't handle my grief, that I had become someone she didn't recognize. My mother stopped speaking to anyone for months. My father threw himself into work until he collapsed from exhaustion, and I became angry, bitter. I couldn't understand why we had all this money, all this power and influence, and yet we couldn't save the one person who mattered most. I started seeing the world differently, seeing how meaningless most of what I had built really was. What good is wealth if it can't protect the people you love? He paused, swallowing hard, and Adana could see the effort it took for him to continue. One night, about a year after Kioma died, I was driving home late from the office. I saw an old woman collapsed on the side of the road. Everyone was just walking past her, stepping around her like she was an obstacle rather than a person. I almost drove past too, but something made me stop. I got out, I helped her, I took her to the hospital. Turned out she had pneumonia and would have died if someone hadn't intervened. And the gratitude in her eyes when she realized someone had cared enough to help her, the simple human connection in that moment. It was the first time since Kioma's death that I felt anything other than emptiness. The car moved through the night, carrying them both toward Lagos, toward whatever future waited there in the sprawling city lights that had just begun to appear on the horizon. Adana listened to Emeka's story and felt something shift inside her, some of her protective walls beginning to crack under the weight of shared grief and understanding. She had spent so long believing that wealthy people couldn't possibly understand suffering, that their money insulated them from the kind of pain that defined her existence. But grief didn't discriminate based on bank accounts, and loss felt the same whether you mourned in a mansion or on a mat in the corner of someone's kitchen. Emeka had loved his sister the way Adana had loved her grandmother, with a fierce devotion that made their absence unbearable. They were both orphans in their own way, both wandering through a world that felt colder and emptier than it should have been. Since then, Emeka continued, his voice steadier now, I've tried to remember that feeling, that moment of connection. I've tried to help when I can, not because I think it makes up for anything or because I want recognition, but because it's the only thing that makes sense anymore. My businesses do well, I make more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes, but none of it means anything if I can't use it to make someone else's burden a little lighter. So when you appeared out of the rain and fixed my car, when you helped me even though you clearly had your own struggles, your own destination, your own crisis you were dealing with, I saw Kioma in you. Not physically, you look nothing like her, but that same stubborn kindness, that determination to do the right thing even when it costs you something. She was like that. She would give away her lunch to classmates who had forgotten theirs, would tutor students for free, would volunteer at the orphanage every weekend. She made the world better just by being in it. And when she died, it felt like all that goodness just vanished, like the world became darker and meaner without her light. Adana felt tears sliding down her cheeks, mixing with the rainwater that still clung to her skin. She understood what he was saying because she had felt the same way after her grandmother died, like someone had turned off the sun and expected her to navigate through permanent darkness. Her grandmother had been the only person who had ever made her feel valuable, who had seen potential in her that no one else bothered to look for. When she died, Adana had lost not just a person but a belief system, the conviction that someone in this world cared whether she lived or died. Emeka was offering her more than just a job and a room. He was offering her the chance to believe again that kindness existed, that not everyone would exploit her vulnerability, that perhaps the world contained pockets of light even in the midst of overwhelming darkness. It was a fragile offering, easy to break, dangerous to accept. But Adana was so tired of being afraid, so exhausted from carrying her pain alone. "I'll take the job," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine and the diminishing sound of rain against the windshield. "But I need you to know that I'll work hard for it. I don't want charity. I don't want to be anyone's project or their way of feeling better about themselves. I want to earn my place, to prove that I deserve the opportunity you're giving me." There was pride in her words, the fierce dignity of someone who had been given nothing and therefore valued everything. Emeka nodded, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw him smile, a small, genuine expression that transformed his entire face, making him look younger and less burdened. "I wouldn't offer you the job if I didn't think you could do it," he said simply. "And from what I've seen tonight, you're more capable than most people I know. You'll earn your place, Adana." "I have no doubt about that." The city lights grew brighter as they approached Lagos, the urban sprawl spreading out before them like a galaxy of artificial stars. Adana pressed her face closer to the window, watching as the dark highway gave way to streetlights and buildings, to traffic and movement and the chaotic energy that defined Nigeria's largest city. She had imagined this moment so many times during her long walk, pictured herself arriving in Lagos with nothing but hope and determination. But she had never imagined arriving like this, in a luxury car driven by a billionaire who had turned out to be kind, with a job already waiting and a room where she could sleep without fear. It felt like a dream, fragile and unreal, and part of her waited for something to shatter the illusion, to reveal this as just another cruel trick that life was playing on her. The Grand Meridian Hotel rose from the heart of Victoria Island like a monument to everything Adana had never dared to dream of, 30 floors of gleaming glass and polished stone, its entrance flanked by marble columns and maintained gardens that seemed impossibly green even in the pre-dawn darkness. They had driven through the sleeping city in companionable silence, leaving behind the chaos of mainland Lagos for the manicured elegance of the island where money lived and breathed in every carefully designed detail. Adana had pressed herself against the car door, making herself as small as possible, as if her poverty might contaminate the luxury that surrounded them. She watched through the window as they passed gated estates with security guards in crisp uniforms, shopping complexes that wouldn't open for hours, restaurants with names in languages she didn't speak. This was a different world entirely from the one she had known, a place where her uncle's entire house could fit into a single hotel suite, where the fountain in front of one building probably cost more than her village earned in a year. The disparity was overwhelming, almost obscene in its magnitude, and Adana felt a familiar shame creeping up her spine, the shame of being poor in a place that celebrated wealth, of being uneducated in a space that valued sophistication, of being nobody in a city full of people who were somebody. Emeka pulled into an underground parking garage, the car descending into the belly of the hotel where the real machinery of luxury operated away from guests' eyes. He parked in a spot marked with his name, and Adana noticed that even his parking space was different from the others, wider and closer to the elevator, a small privilege that spoke volumes about his position in this world. When he turned off the engine, the sudden silence felt heavy with significance, as if they had crossed some invisible threshold and what happened next would determine the shape of her entire future. Emeka turned to look at her fully for the first time since they had started driving, and in the harsh fluorescent light of the parking garage, Adana could see the exhaustion etched into his features, the lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and heavy responsibilities. But there was also something else, a gentleness that seemed at odds with his obvious power, a humanity that money hadn't managed to erase. Mrs. Okafor runs the housekeeping department, he explained, his voice echoing slightly in the concrete space. She's been with me since I opened this hotel 8 years ago. She's tough but fair and she doesn't tolerate laziness or dishonesty. But if you work hard and prove yourself trustworthy, she'll protect you like you're her own daughter. I'll introduce you to her in the morning, explain the situation, and she'll get you settled. Your room will be on the staff floor, nothing fancy but clean and private. You'll have your own bathroom, a bed, a small closet. Meals are provided in the staff cafeteria and your uniform will be issued on your first day. The pay is deposited directly into a bank account, which will help you set up if you don't already have one. Does this sound acceptable to you? The question was posed with genuine interest in her answer, as if her comfort and agreement actually mattered to him. Adana could only nod, her throat too tight with emotion to form words. Acceptable. It was more than acceptable. It was miraculous. It was everything she had prayed for during those long, desperate hours of walking through the rain, believing that no one heard and no one cared. They took the service elevator up to the staff quarters, a utilitarian space that lacked the ornate decoration of the guest elevators but was clean and well-maintained. Adana clutched her small bundle against her chest, hyper-aware of how she must look, her wrapper still damp and muddy, her hair wild and uncombed, her feet bare and bleeding from the long walk. She caught her reflection in the elevator's metal doors and almost didn't recognize herself. When had she become this person, this desperate creature with haunted eyes and hollow cheeks? When had survival become the only thing she hoped for, the only ambition she allowed herself? The elevator dinged softly as they reached the 15th floor, and the doors slid open to reveal a long corridor with numbered doors on either side, each one representing a life, a story, a person who had found their way to this place and made it home. Emeka led her to room 1537, producing a key card from his wallet with the practiced ease of someone who knew every corner of his property. The door swung open to reveal a small but immaculate space, a single bed with crisp white linens, a wooden wardrobe, a small desk with a chair, a window that looked out over the city's sprawling landscape. There was a door that led to a private bathroom which Adana could glimpse from where she stood frozen in the doorway. It wasn't large or luxurious by the standards of the hotel's paying guests, but to Adana, who had spent the last 15 years sleeping on a mat in a corner, sharing a bathroom with 12 other people, and owning nothing that was truly hers, this room represented a kind of wealth she couldn't quite process. This was hers. A space where she could close the door and be alone, where she could breathe without someone telling her she was taking up too much air, where she could exist without apology or justification. "The room is yours for as long as you work here," Emeka said, watching her reaction with an expression that suggested he understood the magnitude of what this meant to her. "I'll leave you to rest now. It's almost 4 in the morning and you've had an impossibly long night. Mrs. Okafor usually arrives around 9, so I'll make sure someone comes to get you around 8:30 so you can shower and prepare yourself. There should be some basic toiletries in the bathroom cabinet, and I'll have one of the staff bring you something to wear tomorrow until we can get you proper uniforms. Is there anything else you need right now? Are you hungry? I can have food sent up from the kitchen." His consideration was almost painful in its thoroughness, and Adana shook her head quickly, afraid that if she tried to speak she would start crying and never stop. She had spent so many years holding herself together through sheer force of will, refusing to let anyone see how close she was to breaking, but Emeka's kindness was undermining all her careful defenses, making her feel things she had worked hard to bury. He seemed to understand her struggle, stepping back to give her space, his hand moving to the door handle. "Adana," he said softly, and something in the way he spoke her name made her look up at him despite her tears. "What you did tonight, helping a stranger when you had every reason to keep walking, when you were facing your own crisis, that says everything about who you are. Don't ever let anyone make you feel like you're less than you are. Don't let this world convince you that poverty equals worthlessness. You have value that has nothing to do with money or status or any of the things people use to measure each other. Hold on to that, remember that." Then he was gone, the door clicking shut behind him, and Adana was alone in her room, in her space, in the first place she had ever been able to call her own. She stood in the center of the small room for a long time, afraid to touch anything, afraid to believe this was real and not just another dream that would dissolve when morning came. Finally, she moved to the window and looked out at the city spread below her, at the lights that marked streets and buildings and lives unfolding in the darkness. Lagos had seemed so terrifying when she was walking toward it alone, a massive unknown that threatened to swallow her whole. But from up here, safely contained behind glass and walls, and the promise of a job that would allow her to build something resembling a life, the city looked different. It looked full of possibility, of second chances, of the kind of transformation that happened when circumstances aligned just right, and someone showed up at exactly the moment they were needed most. Adana thought about Emeka driving along that highway, about his car breaking down in that specific location at that specific time, about her walking for hours only to arrive at precisely the moment when he needed help. It seemed too convenient to be coincidence, too perfectly orchestrated to be random chance. Perhaps her grandmother had been right when she used to say that God worked in mysterious ways, that the universe had patterns and purposes that revealed themselves only in hindsight. She moved to the bathroom, finally allowing herself to explore this space that was somehow hers. The bathroom was small but functional, with a shower, toilet and sink, all gleaming clean and smelling faintly of disinfectant. She found the toiletries Emeka had mentioned, shampoo, soap, toothpaste, a new toothbrush still in its package. She turned on the shower and watched steam begin to fill the room, then slowly peeled off her wet, muddy clothes, letting them fall in a heap on the floor. When she stepped under the hot water, she finally allowed herself to cry, letting out all the fear and exhaustion and overwhelming relief that had been building since the moment Emeka had offered her his hand in the rain. The water washed away days of grime and sweat, but more than that, it felt like it was washing away years of accumulated shame and worthlessness, letting them spiral down the drain along with the dirt. She stood under that stream until the water ran cold, until her fingers pruned and her skin turned pink, until she felt clean in a way that went deeper than physical. When she finally emerged and dried herself with one of the soft towels hanging on the rack, she felt lighter somehow, as if she had shed an old skin and emerged as someone new, someone who might actually have a future worth living. She wrapped herself in the towel and returned to the main room, where the bed waited with its crisp white sheets and soft pillows. Adana had never slept in a bed before, had never experienced the luxury of a mattress that supported her weight or blankets that weren't threadbare and thin. She approached it cautiously, almost reverently, and when she finally lay down, pulling the covers up to her chin, she felt tears spring to her eyes again. The bed was soft, the room was quiet, the door was locked, and she was safe. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Adana closed her eyes without fear of what morning would bring. "You're the one Mr. Okonkwo called me about at 6 o'clock this morning, interrupting my sleep to tell me about some girl he picked up on the highway." Mrs. Okafor's voice cut through Adana's nervous anticipation like a machete through sugarcane, sharp, direct, and impossible to ignore. The woman who stood before her in the hotel's administrative office was nothing like Adana had imagined. She had pictured someone stern and cold, someone who would look at her with the same dismissive contempt that her uncle's wife had perfected over the years. Instead, Mrs. Okafor was a woman in her late 50s with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners, a generous figure that spoke of someone who enjoyed her own cooking, and an air of absolute authority that suggested she had earned every bit of respect she commanded. She wore her uniform with pride, a crisp navy blue dress with the hotel's gold insignia embroidered on the pocket, sensible shoes that had clearly walked thousands of miles through hotel corridors, and her hair wrapped in a beautiful gel that added at least 3 inches to her height. She studied Adana with an intensity that made the younger woman want to squirm, her gaze moving from the borrowed dress that hung loose on Adana's thin frame to the nervous way she clutched her hands together, to the barely healed cuts on her feet that were visible in the simple slippers someone had provided that morning. Mrs. Okafor circled her slowly, and Adana forced herself to stand still under the scrutiny, remembering what Emeka had said about this woman being tough but fair. She could handle tough. Tough was familiar territory. It was kindness that still made her uncomfortable, that still felt like a trap waiting to spring shut. "Mr. Okonkwo doesn't usually involve himself in hiring decisions," Mrs. Okafor continued, her tone giving nothing away. "In fact, in 8 years of working for him, I can count on one hand the number of times he's personally requested that I employ someone. So either you must be very special or he must see something in you that he thinks I need on my team. The question is, which is it? Are you special or did you just catch him in a moment of weakness?" The question wasn't cruel, but it wasn't gentle either. It was honest, demanding an equally honest response, and Adana appreciated that more than false pleasantries or empty reassurances. She lifted her chin slightly, meeting Mrs. Okafor's eyes directly, even though everything in her upbringing told her to look down, to show deference, to make herself smaller in the presence of authority. "I'm not special," she said quietly, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm just someone who needed help and was lucky enough to receive it. But I'm also someone who knows what it means to work hard, who understands that nothing in this life comes easy, and who won't waste the opportunity I've been given. I can't promise I'll know everything right away or that I won't make mistakes, but I can promise that I'll learn fast and work harder than anyone else you have. Not because I want to impress Mr. Okonkwo or prove anything to you, but because I don't have the luxury of failure. This job isn't just a job to me. It's the difference between having a future and having nothing at all." The words came from somewhere deep inside her, From that place where she had stored all her determination and resilience during the years when survival was the only goal that mattered. Mrs. Okafor's expression remained neutral, but something flickered in her eyes, recognition perhaps, or respect for Adana's refusal to play meek or helpless. She moved to her desk and picked up a clipboard, running her finger down what appeared to be a staff roster. "I lost 2 housekeepers last month," she said, her tone shifting to business-like efficiency. "One got pregnant and went back to her village to have the baby. The other one found a job that paid better, or so she thought, though I heard she came crawling back last week asking for her position again. I told her no. When you leave Mrs. Okafor's team, you don't come back. Loyalty matters to me. Reliability matters to me. I need people who will show up on time, do the work properly, and understand that every room we clean, every surface we polish, every detail we attend to reflects not just on this hotel but on all of us who work here. Do you understand what I'm saying?" Adana nodded, sensing that Mrs. Okafor was offering her more than just a job description. She was outlining the terms of a covenant, a mutual agreement built on respect and expectation. The older woman set down the clipboard and moved closer to Adana, her expression softening slightly. "I'm going to tell you something that Mr. Okonkwo probably didn't mention because he's too much of a gentleman to speak about such things. This hotel is full of rich people who will treat you like you're invisible, like you're part of the furniture they expect to see but never really notice. Some of them will be rude, some will make impossible demands. Some will complain about work you did perfectly just because they can, because complaining makes them feel important. And some, especially some of the men, will look at a young, pretty girl like you and think you're available for more than just making their beds and cleaning their toilets. You need to understand this now before you start, before you find yourself in a situation you're not prepared for. Do you know what I'm talking about?" The question was direct, almost blunt, but Adana appreciated the honesty. She had been naive about many things in her life, but she wasn't naive about the dangers that women in vulnerable positions faced from men with power. "I understand," Adana replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I've dealt with men who thought I was nothing, who thought they could take whatever they wanted because I had no one to protect me. I know how to avoid them, how to make myself uninteresting, how to stay safe. I'm not looking for trouble, Mrs. Okafor. I'm just looking for a chance to work and build something that's mine." The older woman nodded, seeming satisfied with this answer. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a set of uniforms still wrapped in plastic, along with a name tag that had been freshly printed with ADANNA in bold letters. "Your shift starts at 6 in the morning and ends at 2 in the afternoon, 6 days a week. Sundays are your day off. You'll work with a partner for the first 2 weeks while you learn our procedures and standards. After that, you'll have your own section of floors to manage. You break something expensive, it comes out of your pay. You steal something, even something small, and I'll not only fire you but make sure you never work in any hotel in Lagos again. Are we clear on that?" Adana accepted the uniforms with hands that trembled slightly, nodding her understanding of the terms. Mrs. Okafor's expression softened further, and for the first time since Adana had entered the office, she allowed herself to smile, a small, warm expression that transformed her entire face. "That said, you work hard and you're honest with me, and I'll make sure you're treated fairly. I'll teach you everything I know about this business, and trust me, child, I know plenty. I started where you're starting, cleaning toilets and changing sheets, and I worked my way up to running the entire housekeeping operation for 6 hotels across Nigeria. There's a path forward if you want it, if you're willing to work for it. Mr. Okonkwo is a good man who gives people chances, but it's what you do with those chances that determines where you end up. Don't waste this. Don't be like those silly girls who think because a man in an expensive suit smiles at them, they're going to become his wife and live in a mansion. Keep your head down, do your work, save your money, and build something real. That's my advice, and you can take it or leave it." Adana felt her eyes burning with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude mixed with determination. She thought of her grandmother, who would have loved Mrs. Okafor, who would have appreciated this no-nonsense approach to life wrapped in genuine care. "I'll make you proud," she promised, her voice thick with emotion. I know you're taking a chance on me because Mr. Okonkwo asked you to, but I'll prove that I deserve to be here on my own merit. Thank you for giving me this opportunity." Mrs. Okafor waved away the gratitude with a brisk gesture, already moving toward the door to show Adana where she would begin her training. But just before they left the office, she paused and turned back, her hand resting lightly on Adana's shoulder. "One more thing, child. Whatever happened to you before you came here, whatever pain you're carrying, whatever made you desperate enough to walk alone on that highway in the middle of the night, you can let it go now. This is a new chapter. You're safe here. You're valued here, and as long as you do right by this hotel and by the people who work in it, I'll protect you like you're my own daughter. That's a promise." The words broke something loose in Adana's chest, some last piece of armor she had been holding in place to keep herself from feeling too much, from hoping too desperately. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold back the tears that wanted to fall, and managed a shaky smile. "Thank you, Ma," she whispered, using the respectful term that came naturally to her. Mrs. Okafor nodded, satisfied, and then they were moving through the hotel's service corridors, the older woman pointing out supply closets and explaining procedures in a steady stream of information that Adana absorbed like someone dying of thirst finally offered water. She learned about the different types of rooms, the specific cleaning protocols for each, the importance of checking inventory and reporting damages, the subtle art of being present but invisible when guests were in their rooms. Mrs. Okafor introduced her to other members of the housekeeping staff, women of various ages who welcomed her with a mixture of curiosity and cautious friendliness, understanding that she was new, but also that she had been personally recommended by the owner himself, which gave her a certain status that needed to be navigated carefully. By the time her first day ended, Adana's feet ached, her back hurt, and her hands were raw from chemicals and hot water. But she felt more alive than she had in years, more purposeful, more like a person who mattered. She returned to her small room on the 15th floor and lay down on her bed in her room, in a building where she was employed and valued and safe. She thought about Emeka, wondering if he was somewhere in this massive hotel or if he had gone to one of his other properties, if he was thinking about the girl he had picked up on the highway, or if he had already moved on to more important concerns. She wondered if their paths would cross again, or if his kindness had been a one-time intervention, a momentary intersection of two lives that would now continue on separate tracks. Part of her hoped to see him again, to thank him properly for everything he had done, to show him that his faith in her hadn't been misplaced. But another part of her hoped their paths wouldn't cross, feared what it might mean if the boundary between staff and owner became blurred, understood instinctively that some distances were meant to be maintained for everyone's protection. 3 months passed like water flowing through open fingers, quick enough to feel like no time at all, slow enough that Adana could mark the changes in herself with startling clarity. She had become someone she barely recognized when she caught glimpses of herself in the hotel's many mirrors. Her face had filled out slightly, the hollows in her cheeks softening as regular meals did their healing work. Her hands, though still rough from cleaning solutions and hard labor, no longer trembled with the weakness of starvation. Her eyes, which had held nothing but wariness and pain that rainy night on the highway, now carried something different, not quite hope, not yet confidence, but perhaps the beginning of both. She moved through the hotel corridors with purpose, her uniform crisp and clean, her name tag pinned proudly to her chest, and when guests passed her in the hallways, she no longer felt the instinct to shrink away or make herself invisible. She was learning that there was dignity in honest work, that serving others well was not the same as being servile, that she could be both humble and proud simultaneously. Mrs. Okafor had been true to her word, teaching Adana not just the mechanics of housekeeping but the philosophy behind it, the understanding that every room was someone's temporary home, every clean surface a small gift to a weary traveler, every perfectly made bed an act of care for a stranger who might be having the worst day of their life and needed at least one thing to be right. Adana had learned to read rooms the way others read books, to understand the stories they told through scattered belongings and unmade beds, to anticipate needs before they were voiced and solve problems before they became complaints. She had proven herself reliable, showing up early and staying late when necessary, volunteering for the difficult assignments that other staff members avoided, and never once complaining about the endless physical demands of the work. Mrs. Okafor had noticed, had nodded her approval in that economical way she had, and had begun giving Adana more responsibility, more independence, more of those small signals that indicated trust was being built brick by patient brick. But despite her growing competence and the cautious friendships she had formed with other members of the housekeeping staff, despite the safety of her small room and the regular paycheck that she saved with obsessive care, there remained an emptiness that Adana couldn't quite name or dismiss. She had not seen Emeka since that first night, though evidence of his presence was everywhere, in the memos that came down from the executive offices, in the high standards that permeated every aspect of the hotel's operation, in the respectful way staff spoke his name, mixing admiration with genuine affection. She had heard stories about him during lunch breaks in the staff cafeteria, tales of his generosity toward employees in crisis, his habit of remembering names and asking about family members, his insistence on fair wages and good working conditions even when other hotels in the city exploited their workers ruthlessly. The other staff members spoke of him with a loyalty that went beyond mere employment, and Adana understood why. He had built something here that was more than a business. He had created a place where people could work with dignity, where effort was rewarded, where human value was recognized regardless of position or status. She thought about him more than she should have, more than was wise or appropriate. Late at night, lying in her bed and listening to the city sounds drifting through her window, she would replay that drive from the highway to the hotel, remembering the timbre of his voice when he spoke about his sister, the gentleness in his hands when he had grabbed her arm to stop her from walking away, the way he had looked at her not with pity but with recognition, as if he saw her as a person rather than a problem to be solved. She told herself it was gratitude she felt, nothing more complicated than appreciation for the man who had changed her life with a single act of kindness. But sometimes, in her most honest moments, she acknowledged that it was more than that, something deeper and more dangerous that she had no right to feel. He was a billionaire, the owner of multiple businesses, a man who moved in circles so far removed from hers that they might as well exist in different universes. She was a housekeeping staff member, an orphan with no family and no education, someone who had been nothing and nobody before that rainy night. The distance between them was unbridgeable, and she knew it, accepted it, tried to make peace with it. Then, on a Tuesday morning in her 4th month of employment, everything changed. Adana was working on the 23rd floor, one of the hotel's premium levels where the suites cost more per night than she earned in a month. She had just finished cleaning room 2307 and was pushing her cart toward the next assignment when she heard raised voices coming from the suite at the end of the corridor. The door was partially open, and through the gap she could see movement, could hear a woman's voice sharp with anger and a man's voice trying to reason with her. Adana's training told her to move past quickly, to respect guest privacy and avoid involvement in personal disputes, but something about the man's voice made her pause. It was familiar in a way that made her heart skip a beat, though she told herself it couldn't be, that there were thousands of men in Lagos who might sound similar, that she was imagining connections that didn't exist. But then the woman stormed out of the suite, moving so fast that she nearly collided with Adana and her cleaning cart. She was beautiful in the way that expensive maintenance and good genetics could make someone beautiful, tall and slim, wearing designer clothes that probably cost more than Adana's entire yearly salary, her makeup perfect despite the tears of rage that streaked her face. She stopped when she saw Adana, and for a moment their eyes met. The contempt in the woman's gaze was instantaneous and absolute, the kind of disdain that people who had never known hardship reserved for those they considered beneath them. "Move," she snapped, gesturing imperiously at the cleaning cart that partially blocked the corridor. "Don't just stand there staring like an idiot. Do your job and get out of my way." Adana moved quickly, pushing the cart against the wall to clear a path, and the woman swept past without another word, her expensive perfume lingering in the air like an accusation. The suite door was still open, and before Adana could move away, before she could retreat back into the safety of anonymity and invisible service, Emeka appeared in the doorway. He looked different than she remembered, older, somehow more tired, wearing a business suit that was slightly rumpled as if he had been wearing it for too long. But when his eyes landed on her, when recognition flashed across his face followed by something that looked like relief, he was exactly as she remembered him. Adana, he said, and the way he spoke her name made everything inside her go still and quiet. He stepped into the corridor, letting the suite door close behind him, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other, separated by only a few feet of expensive carpet, but feeling the weight of all the distance and difference that truly lay between them. "I've been wondering how you were doing," he continued, his voice softer now, almost uncertain. "Mrs. Okafor gives me updates, tells me you're doing excellent work, that you've become one of her most reliable staff members. I'm glad, I'm so glad it's working out." Adana didn't know what to say, didn't know how to respond to this man who had saved her life and then disappeared from it, who had given her everything and asked for nothing in return, who was standing in front of her now looking at her like she mattered, like seeing her again meant something to him. She fell back on training, on the professional distance that Mrs. Okafor had taught her to maintain. "Thank you, sir," she managed, her voice steady despite the chaos of emotions churning inside her. "I'm very grateful for the opportunity you gave me. I hope I'm proving worthy of your faith in me." The formality sounded wrong even as she spoke it, creating a barrier between them that felt both necessary and painful. Emeka's expression shifted, something that might have been disappointment flickering across his features before he smoothed it away. "You don't need to call me sir," he said quietly. "Not you, not after what we went through that night. My name is Emeka, remember." Before Adana could respond, before she could navigate the complicated terrain between professional propriety and personal connection, the elevator at the end of the corridor dinged and Mrs. Okafor emerged, her experienced eyes taking in the scene with the kind of instant assessment that came from decades of managing people and situations. She moved toward them with purposeful strides, her expression neutral but her gaze sharp. "Mr. Okonkwo," she greeted him with respectful formality, then turned to Adana. "The guests in 2312 have checked out early. I need you to prioritize that room so we can get it ready for the next arrival." It was a dismissal wrapped in a work assignment, and Adana recognized it for what it was, Mrs. Okafor protecting her, maintaining the boundaries that needed to exist between staff and ownership, even if those boundaries felt like prison walls in this particular moment. Adana nodded, murmuring her acknowledgement, and moved to collect her cart. But as she passed Emeka, he reached out and caught her hand, just for a second, just long enough for his fingers to close around hers in a grip that was gentle but urgent. "Wait," he said, and there was something in his voice that made both Adana and Mrs. Okafor pause. "I need to talk to you, not now obviously, but soon. Please, would you meet me tomorrow evening after your shift ends? There's a small cafe 2 blocks from here, Mama Ngozi's place. Do you know it?" Adana shook her head, her heart pounding so hard she was sure both he and Mrs. Okafor could hear it. "I'll find it," she said, the words coming from somewhere beyond conscious thought, beyond all the reasonable objections that should have made her refuse. Emeka's face transformed, that rare smile breaking through his usual serious expression, and he squeezed her hand once before releasing it. 2:30 tomorrow, then. "I'll be waiting." Mrs. Okafor waited until Emeka had returned to his suite, and the door had closed firmly behind him before she turned to Adana with an expression that was equal parts concern and resignation. She didn't speak immediately, just studied the younger woman with eyes that had seen too much of life to be easily fooled. Finally, she sighed, a sound heavy with complicated emotions. "Be careful, child," she said quietly, her voice stripped of its usual brisk authority and filled instead with something that sounded like maternal worry. "I know you're grateful to him, I know he saved you when you needed saving, and I know Mr. Okonkwo is a good man, better than most who have his kind of wealth and power. But there are lines in this world, boundaries that exist for good reasons, and when those lines get crossed, it's never the powerful one who pays the price. It's always the girl from nothing, the one who has everything to lose and nothing to bargain with. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Adana understood, or at least she understood what Mrs. Okafor feared, that she would become another naive girl who mistook kindness for love, who confused gratitude with genuine connection, who would end up hurt and discarded when the novelty wore off and reality reasserted itself. I just want to thank him properly, Adana said, though even she wasn't sure if that was entirely true, if there wasn't something else tangled up in her desire to see him again, to talk to him without the weight of professional boundaries pressing down on every word. That's all, just a conversation to express my gratitude, nothing more. Mrs. Okafor's expression suggested she didn't entirely believe this explanation, but she also seemed to recognize that Adana was going to make her own decisions, learn her own lessons, walk her own path regardless of warnings or wisdom offered. Remember what I told you on your first day, the older woman said finally. Don't be like those silly girls who think a smile from a rich man means they're going to live in a mansion. Keep your feet on the ground, child. Keep your heart protected. And whatever you do, don't forget where you came from or how hard you worked to get where you are now. One conversation with Mr. Okonkwo won't change your life again, but losing focus, losing sight of your goals, losing yourself in dreams that can't come true, that could cost you everything you've built. Then she was gone, leaving Adana alone in the corridor with her cleaning cart and her churning thoughts and the knowledge that tomorrow at 2:30, she would walk into Mama Ngozi's cafe, and whatever happened next would determine the shape of everything that followed.